Today we are almost done with Farewell to Manzanar. We're going to read chapters 14 through 16. I'm going to go ahead and get right into chapter 14, which is called In the Fire Break. He was right, of course. I did not know what I was getting myself into. Years later, I silently thanked him for forcing me to postpone such decisions until I was old enough to think for myself. But at the time it was unforgivable, and it was typical of his behavior during those days. He had no boat crew to command, no income to manage, no trips to plan, not even a dining table to preside over. He would putter blandly along, then suddenly, unexpectedly, as if to remind himself he was still in charge of something, he would burst out like that. His intentions right, but his manner stubborn and relentless, forcing distances between us. As his youngest child, I had grown up blessed with special attentions. Now, more and more, I found myself cut off from him. When I needed reassurance, I would get it from Woody or Shizu or from Mama, who had more of herself to give by this time. Then one afternoon there came a moment when I was cut off from both of them, Papa and Mama together. It wasn't loneliness I felt, or isolation. They were still within reach. Rather, it was the first brief flicker of total separateness. It could have occurred anywhere we might have been living. I had reached the age. This scene happened to be set in one of the fire breaks at Manzanar. My oldest sister Eleanor figures in it. She lay in the camp hospital trying to give birth to a baby she had thought she'd be having in Reno, Nevada, where she and her husband Shig had relocated in 1943. Through friends, they had found a house there, and Shig lined up a job in a restaurant. Early in 1944, the government decided that Nisei should be eligible for selective service, like all other American citizens. A few months later, Shig was drafted. Eleanor, pregnant, could find neither work nor money enough to pay for having a baby. She couldn't stay in Reno, and she couldn't go with Shig to the Army's training camp in Louisiana, so she voluntarily re-entered camp. When she went into the hospital, it was a time of great anxiety in our family. Two of my other sisters had born children there. They had both hemorrhaged badly, so hemorrhaged is bleeding a lot, and blood plasma was in short supply, our needs being low on the wartime priority list. One sister might have died had not Woody provided blood by direct transfusion. In the case of a sister-in-law of ours who had miscarried and hemorrhaged, no one was able to arrest it in time, and she just bled to death in her hospital bed. These memories were very much with us. Papa in particular was worried. Eleanor was his oldest daughter, and this was her first child. Her husband had gone to Germany with an infantry division, and now she was struggling through the second day of difficult labor. He and Mama were taking turns sitting with her, and what I remember late the second afternoon is Mama running towards us from the other side of the fire break. I was walking with Papa as he stared out for the hospital, and here she came, small and running, all bundled up. It was December, shouting, "Co! Co!" making little puffs of frost in the icy air. I looked at Papa, and his face had filled with terror. He tried to run to meet her, but could barely keep his stride. His look filled me with terror, too. I was sure Eleanor had died in the hospital. Our fear must have held back Mama's progress. It seemed we watched her run for minutes across the stretch of cleared sand. There was room enough for a football game or an entire parade. In my eyes then it was a threatening openness, a no man's land. We met her in the sand, Mama breathless, small in front of him, looking up, saying, "Co, Co, it's a boy." His face gave way, his eyes filled. "A boy?" "Yes." And Eleanor, "Yes, okay. Okay. They're both okay." His tears let go unchecked. Mama was already crying. She began to talk excitedly, jabbering the details. As the news sunk in, my fear was replaced by an odd detachment. The burden fell away, leaving me afloat, and I was a spectator witnessing the nearest to a love scene I would ever see between them. My own perception removed me from it. I was more awed than aware, but I knew whatever I was watching was somehow both tender and profound, with an intimacy that made me invisible to them. Papa put an arm around her, needing her support. He was wearing the rust-colored turtleneck sweater he used to take on fishing trips, the one she had knitted for him before the war. Now, as she talked, the fingers of one hand played over its yarn as if inspecting her own workmanship. While the late sun turned this rusty sweater dark shades of orange, they stood there in the great expanse of the firebreak, far out from the rows of barracks, weeping with relief and happiness, talking quietly, just the two of them. All right, and that is the end of chapter 14. And I need some water. And chapter 15 is called Departures. So we're going to read 15 and 16. In the months to come, they would draw together even more closely, just as I would hold to them. My moment of separateness a foreshadowing, but not yet a reality. Our family had begun to dwindle along with the entire camp population. By the end of 1944, about 6,000 people remained, and those, for the most part, were the aging and the young. Whoever had prospects on the outside and the energy to go was leaving, relocating, or entering military service. No one could blame them. To most of the Nisei, anything looked better than remaining in camp. For many of their parents, just the opposite was true. Eleanor and Shig had been the first of my family to leave. A few months after she had her baby, she moved back to Reno to stay with friends there. The next to go was Woody, who in August 1944 had been drafted. When the notice came, he showed it to Papa. "And now what will you do?" Papa said glumly. "I have to go." "What if you refuse to answer the letter?" "It's my duty." "What about those 26 boys from Tule Lake who refused to report? The judge in San Francisco ruled that they were right. It was in the papers. You can't lock somebody up because he might be disloyal and then make him join the army. That was the judge's conclusion." "Well, right now, Tom Dobishi, who used to live over in Block 9, is in jail in Los Angeles for refusing to report for his physical." "He was already in jail." Woody blinked, missing the point at first. Then he grinned. "Come on, Pop. It's not that bad out here. Not anymore." "Then why don't you stay?" "I'm gonna stay, for a while, until they call me up. They put me in the reserve unit in camp. It could be months. Maybe the war will be over by then." His unit was called up in November. We all went down to see them off at the main gate. 19 young men in their teens and 20s, some wearing suits and ties, some, like Woody, wearing overcoats and neck scarves against the cold, carrying satchels, traveling bags, shaving kits. They lined up 2 deep for a photo that ran later in the camp paper. Then we watched Woody join the shuffling line and climb aboard. For me, it was almost like watching Papa leave again. I didn't know where he was going or understand quite why. When his bus pulled out, I only knew that if anything happened to him, the world would probably be coming to an end, because nothing could happen to Woody. He had always been so solid. I hugged Mama while we watched his final wave through the window, his mustache lifting above that impish smile, as if we had all just pulled a fast one on the world. So what Jean's saying there when she said they all pulled a fast one on the world, it's almost like they feel like they know the war must almost be over, because if Woody's going to war and going to fight, they think it's about to wrap things up because nothing ever happens to Woody. That's their idea. Shizu was with us waving back. This made it almost like the day 3 years earlier we had watched the boat sail out of San Pedro Harbor, except that Shizu had 2 children now, and instead of a handful of fishermen's wives, there were 500 others with us here. They had turned out like people in small towns all over the country to watch their young men leave. The 442nd Combat Regiment was famous now, full of heroes, fighting in Europe to help the Allies win the war, and showing that Niseis too could be patriots. Woody was that kind of Nisei, anxious to prove to the world his loyalty, his manhood, something about his family honor. Climbing aboard, he must have been thinking of those things, while Mama, no doubt, was thinking of the mother at Manzanar who had already received a posthumous Congressional Medal of Honor. So posthumous means after death. So the mother received the medal after the death of her son. So Congressional Medal of Honor on behalf of her son who'd been killed in Italy. In these ways, it was a typical wartime departure full of proud smiles and half-concealed worry. In other ways, it was edged with unique uncertainties. Families were being further torn asunder, so asunder is apart, and those left behind knew no more about their own fate than they did of the loved ones moving on. Would we still be here after the war? Would we be living forever in the summer heat and winter wind of Owens Valley? And if not there, then where else? The answers to these questions, when they came, only added to our insecurity. All right, and that is the end of chapter 15. So we're going to go on to 16, and that'll be our last one for today. It is called Free to Go. The answers began with a Supreme Court ruling that December in the case called Ex parte Indo. It was the last of 3 key cases heard since the camps had opened. In the first, Gordon Hirabayashi, a Nisei student from the University of Washington, challenged the evacuation order. He had also violated the Army's curfew, imposed early in 1942 on all West Coast Japanese. He challenged the racial bias of these actions and the abuse of his civil rights. The court avoided the issue of the evacuation itself by ruling on the curfew. It upheld the Army's decision to limit the movements of a racially select group of citizens. The reasoning, wartime necessity. In the second case, the issue was the exclusion orders that removed us from our homes and sent us inland. Fred Korematsu, a young Nisei living in Oakland, had ignored the evacuation to stay with his Caucasian girlfriend. He had plastic surgery done on his face, he changed his name, and was posing as a Spanish Hawaiian when the FBI caught up with him. In court, the racial bias was challenged again. Why were no German Americans evacuated, it was asked, or Americans of Italian descent? Weren't these nations our enemies too? Due process had been violated, Korematsu claimed, along with other constitutional rights, but the Army's decision to evacuate was also upheld by the Supreme Court. The final case challenged the internment itself. Soon after she was evacuated in April 1942, Mitsu Indo, a 21-year-old Nisei and an employee of the California State Highway Commission, had filed a petition for habeas corpus protesting her detention at Topaz Camp in central Utah. She spent 2.5 years awaiting the High Court's decision, which was that she had been right. The government cannot detain loyal citizens against their will. Anticipating this ruling, the Army's Western Defense Command had already announced that the mass exclusion orders of 1942 were being rescinded. So, rescinded's like taken back. Next, it was announced that all the camps would be closed within the coming 12 months and that internees now had the right to return to their former homes. Let me get some water real quick. Sorry. In our family, the response to this news was hardly joyful. For one thing, we had no home to return to. Worse, the very thought of going back to the West Coast filled us with dread. What will they think of us, those who sent us here? How will they look at us? 3 years of wartime propaganda, racist headlines, atrocity movies, hate slogans, and fright masked posters had turned the Japanese face into something despicable and grotesque. Mama and Papa knew this. They had been reading the papers. Even I knew this, although it was not until many years later that I realized how bad things actually were. In addition to the traditionally racist organizations like the American Legion and the Native Sons of the Golden West, who had been agitating against the West Coast Japanese for decades, new groups had sprung up during the war, with the specific purpose of preventing anyone of Japanese descent from returning to the coast. Groups like No Japs Incorporated in San Diego, the Homefront Commandos in Sacramento, and the Pacific Coast Japanese Problem League in Los Angeles. Also, some growers' associations, threatened by the return of interned farmers, had been using the war as a way to foment hostile feelings in the major farming areas. So foment is stirring up or making them worse. So the farmers were kind of happy that the Japanese were interned because a lot of them were farmers. So when they were interned, there was more business for the other farmers. So them coming back was a problem for these farmers. What's more, our years of isolation at Manzanar had widened the already spacious gap between the races, and it is not hard to understand why so many preferred to stay where they were. Before the war, one of the standard charges made against the Japanese was their clannishness. So clannishness, think about like a clan staying together. So they're saying one of the things that people didn't like about the Japanese, they would say, was that they were so exclusive, they hung out together. Their standoffishness, their refusal to assimilate. The camps had made this a reality in the extreme. After 3 years in our desert ghetto, at least we knew where we stood with our neighbors, could live more or less at ease with them. Yet now the government was saying we not only were free to go, like the move out of Terminal Island and the move out of Owens Valley, we had to go. Definite dates were being fixed for the closing of the camp. By January of 45, a few determined internees were already trying to recover former homes and farmlands. Ominous reports of their reception began trickling back to confirm our deepest fears. A Nisei man had been assaulted on the street in Seattle. A home was burned in San Jose. Night riders carrying shotguns had opened fire on a farmhouse near Fresno, narrowly missing 2 sleeping children. Later on in May, one of my sisters and her husband, leaving for the east, were escorted to the Southern Pacific Depot in Los Angeles by armed guards, not because they were thought to be dangerous, but for their own protection. Most of the Japanese returning to the coast resettled without suffering bodily harm, but gossip tends to thrive on bad news, not good. Stories such as these spread through the camp and grew in our minds like tumors. I remember hearing them discussed in our barracks, quietly, as if Ku Klux Klansmen lurked outside the window, the same way my brothers discussed our dilemma during the brief stay in Boyle Heights before the evacuation. I would listen to the stories and I would cringe, and this was both odd and confusing to me, because ever since we'd arrived, the outside world had loomed in my imagination as someplace inaccessible yet wonderfully desirable. I would recall our days in Ocean Park. I would flip through the Sears Roebuck catalog, dreaming of the dresses and boots and coats that were out there somewhere at the other end of the highway, beyond the gate. All the truly good things, it often seemed, the things we couldn't get, were outside and had to be sent for or shipped in. In this sense, God and the Sears Roebuck catalog were pretty much one and the same thing in my young mind. Once during a novena, which is just a ceremony, at the Mary Knoll Chapel, I had asked for something I desperately longed for and had never seen inside the camp. We were told to ask for something we really wanted. We were to write it on a piece of paper, pray devoutly for 9 days, and if we prayed well, it would be answered. The nuns expected us to ask for purity of soul or a holy life. I asked God for some dried apricots. I wrote this on a piece of paper, dropped it into the prayer box, and began to fantasize about how they would arrive in a package from Sears Roebuck. I knew how they would taste and feel in my hands. I said my rosary 30 times a day for 9 days, and for 9 more days after that I waited. The dried apricots never came. My faith in God and in the Catholic Church slipped several notches at that time, but my faith in the outside, where all such good things could be found, but not my faith in the outside, where all such good things could be found. I went back to flipping through the catalog. Those images, of course, had come from my past. What I had to face now, a year later, was the future. I was old enough to imagine it and also old enough to fear it. The physical violence didn't trouble me. Somehow I didn't quite believe that, or didn't want to believe such things could happen to us. It was the humiliation, that continuous, unnamed ache I have been living with was precise and definable now. Call it the foretaste of being hated. I knew ahead of time that if someone looked at me with hate, I would have to allow it, to swallow it, because something in me, something about me, deserved it. At 10, I saw that coming like a judge's sentence, and I would have stayed inside the camp forever rather than step outside and face such a moment. I shared this particular paralysis with Mama and Papa, but not with my older brothers and sisters. The hostility worried them, but their desire to be rid of Manzanar outweighed that worry. They were in their 20s and they had their lives to lead. They decided to take a chance on the East Coast. It was 3,000 miles away with no history of anti-Orientalism, in fact, no Oriental history at all. So few people of Asian ancestry had settled there, it was like heading for a neutral country. Bill was the first to make that move, with Tommy and their baby boy. He had lined up a job with Seabrook Farms in New Jersey, a new frozen food enterprise that offered work to many Nisei at the end of the war. A few weeks later, Frances and her husband joined them, followed by Martha and Kaz, then Lillian, who was just finishing her junior year in high school, and Ray. As each cluster of relatives departed, we'd say, "See you in New Jersey, find us all a big house back there." What we told each other was that Bill and Frances and the others would go on ahead, make sure things could be worked out, then they'd send for the rest of us. "See you in New Jersey," we would wave as the bus pulled out, taking someone else to the train station in LA. But they all knew, even as they said it, that Papa would never move back east. As bad as the West Coast sounded, it was still his home territory. He was too old to start over, too afraid of rejection in an unknown part of the world, too stubborn and too tired to travel that far, and finally too proud to do piecework on an assembly line. Like so many Issei, he had, for better or worse, run his own businesses, been his own man for too long to tolerate the idea of working for someone else. The truth was, at this point, Papa did not know which way to turn. In the government's eyes, a free man now, he sat, like those black slaves you hear about who, when they got word of their freedom at the end of the Civil War, just did not know where else to go or what else to do, and ended up back on the plantation, rooted there out of habit or lethargy or fear. Okay. So that is the end of chapter 16. Like I said, we will be finishing this book this week. We are almost done. Only have a few more chapters to go. Your reading check for this one is 20 questions. It's a Google Forms link posted on Teams today. So just email me if you have any questions. Let me know how I can help you with the reading check. And I hope you guys have a great day.